George I was born on May 28, 1660, in Hanover, Germany, as the eldest son of Ernest Augustus, Elector of Hanover, and Sophia of the Palatinate, who was the granddaughter of King James I. After the death of his father in 1698, George I succeeded him as Elector of Hanover, ruling the territory until his death in 1727. George I married his cousin Sophia Dorothea of Celle in 1682, but the marriage was unhappy, and she was accused of having an affair with a Swedish count in 1694. George also had mistresses he preferred to be with. George I divorced her and kept her imprisoned for the rest of her life. Her lover was murdered and thrown into the River Leen, weighted with stones. George stayed with his mistress until his death, and they had 3 daughters. The Act of Settlement of 1701 ensured that the British throne would pass to a Protestant successor. When Queen Anne died without a direct heir in 1714, George I, as a Protestant descendant of James I, was next in line to the throne. It was through his mother's line that he would inherit the throne in 1714, bypassing around 60 Stuart claims of succession rights. George I arrived in England on September 18, 1714, and was crowned king on October 20, 1714, at Westminster Abbey. He was 54 when he became king. The House of Hanover succeeded the House of Stuart as the ruling dynasty in Great Britain and Ireland, and George I became the first Hanoverian monarch of Great Britain. The divine right of kings was at an end, and it was Parliament who now decided who had succession rights. George I spoke little English and relied heavily on his ministers, particularly Sir Robert Walpole, who became his chief advisor and later the first Prime Minister of Britain. The War of the Quadruple Alliance began in 1718 and was fought against Spain over territorial disputes in Europe and the Americas. The British forces under Admiral George Byng were victorious in the Battle of Cape Passaro in 1718, and the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of The Hague in 1720. The Jacobite uprisings in Scotland in 1715 and 1719 were attempts to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne. The 1715 rebellion, led by James Francis Edward Stuart, was defeated at the Battle of Preston, and the 1719 rebellion, led by the Earl of Mar, was quashed by British forces. The Septennial Act of 1716 extended the maximum term of Parliament from 3 to 7 years, ensuring that George I's Whig government would have a longer period of stability. The office of Prime Minister was first created in 1717 under George I, with Robert Walpole serving as the first Prime Minister of Britain. The South Sea Bubble financial crisis of 1720 was a speculative bubble in which investors purchased shares in the South Sea Company, which had been granted a monopoly on trade with Spanish America. The bubble burst, and many investors went bankrupt, causing economic turmoil in Britain. Thousands lost investments overnight, and as the king was governor of the company, he and his advisors became the target of much discontent, threatening to end the Hanoverian line before it had started. It was left to Robert Walpole to sort the mess out, using his political skills, and this increased his influence, whilst George relied on him to dig him out of this monarchical disaster. George I was a Lutheran, and as a result, he was unable to receive communion in the Church of England, which was the official church of Britain. However, he respected the Church of England and allowed it to remain the established church of the country. George I was known for his love of hunting, and he spent much of his time at his country estate in Hanover, where he could indulge in his passion for the sport. George I had a difficult relationship with his son, George II, who resented his father's reliance on Robert Walpole and his refusal to grant him more power. The two were often at odds over political and personal matters. George I died on June 11, 1727, of a stroke. He was 67. George I's death was unexpected, as he died suddenly while on a trip to his native Hanover. He was buried in the chapel of the Leen Palace in Hanover. George I was succeeded by his son, George II, who had been serving as his regent during his trips to Hanover. George II's reign would be marked by a series of conflicts, including the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. George I's legacy was mixed. On the one hand, he helped to stabilize the British monarchy and establish the House of Hanover as a ruling dynasty. He also presided over a period of relative peace and prosperity in Britain, despite the financial crisis of the South Sea Bubble. On the other hand, he was seen by many as a foreigner, perceived as being too German, who was out of touch with his subjects, and his inability to speak English made it difficult for him to connect with the British people. Despite these criticisms, George I's reign marked an important turning point in British history, as it saw the emergence of the modern system of parliamentary government and the consolidation of the Whig Party as a dominant political force. George I's legacy would be felt for generations to come, as the Hanoverian dynasty would continue to rule Britain until the death of Queen Victoria in 1901.